Whether you think it or not, Earth is a pretty good setup. You walk around, you see a tree, maybe a cow, people waving at you to get off their property.
Garbage day!
All in all, with its temperate climate, predictable day and night cycles, and abundance of water, Earth has been pretty good to our species. However, not all can be said for every species that resides on our planet. Within the water is an ancient war that has been going on since life first sprung up. You see, there are a few lines of thinking concerning this war, but it is one that is highly interesting. Within our oceans, prokaryotes struggle daily to survive the onslaught of viruses. Roughly 20% of all microorganism biomass is destroyed each day by viruses, and it's estimated that there's roughly 15 times as many viruses in the ocean as there are bacteria. Now, there is something to be said about the whole predator-prey interaction. Clearly, the virus is the predator in this scenario, and the bacteria in the ocean would be its prey. But it seems like a lot, doesn't it? I mean, can you imagine if on land there was a species that annihilated 20% of the total population of its prey daily? That would be a horrifying scenario on a macro scale. So the question becomes, how did this arrangement even come to be if it is so destructive? Well, first you have to quantify what a virus even is. Is it alive? Well, it seems that it wants to go on, but it doesn't necessarily react to the environment like something considered wholly alive would. The fact is, viruses exist between a sketchy area of being considered living and also not living. It only becomes more odd when you begin discussing how viruses even cropped up on our planet. For life to be life, there are key points that must be maintained in order to be designated as such. They must grow, they must reproduce, they must maintain an internal homeostasis, respond to stimuli, and carry out various metabolic processes. And with most life holding true to these tenets, we also see evolution over time. With viruses, obviously, there is a major issue. They themselves differ from any other living organism in that they do not carry out metabolic processes. Because of this, obviously there's a major hit if they're living or not. Coupled with the issue of no metabolism, they also don't have the ability to generate ATP, ergo they cannot power themselves, nor do they have the machinery necessary to actually conduct translation since they lack ribosomes. This would designate them as an obligate intercellular parasite. And this is why there is a bit of an argument in the microbiology field over if these things should be considered alive or not. Sort of like how prions do not fall into the same category of life and are as such not considered alive. There are typically two lines of thinking. The first is the evolutionary hypothesis concerning viruses, and it's still a hypothesis because we aren't even sure like 100% if this is the case or not, as mentioned previously. The entire topic is still a little murky because orders of events cannot be drawn together to form a complete picture. But we know they are packets of genetic material that can move between cells but are reliant on said cells. Over time, they began to have an innate desire to continue on, and again, if it's just genetic material, why would there be an innate desire to propagate? I mean, it's very strange, is it not? Eventually, this led to them being housed in an invasive package that allowed them to infiltrate cells as life got a whole lot more lame for any cell on this planet, us included. The other possibility is maybe they're actually not even from here. This one is a little more out there, but what we have found with viruses is while they can be absolute chumps, they can also survive harsh environments that rival bacteria entering their spore stage. Concerning losers, the big bad known as HIV can exist for only about 30 seconds outside the human body before it becomes completely inert and deactivated. Now, if it's housed within blood, that time is much longer. I think it's about a few hours if I remember correctly. But other viruses have exhibited the ability to literally be blasted up into the atmosphere, into the stratosphere. They come back down thousands of miles away, and that's thousands of kilometers for everyone else on the rest of the planet. Quick maths. But the point of this is, descending out of the sky seems to be an interesting feature of the virus, and that's why when I finally wrap up my YouTube career, I like to go back and get my master's in virology and start studying that. Then probably return to YouTube as like a grizzled scientist spouting conspiracy theories about viruses, so watch out for Roanoke 2 Viral Boogaloo. And also to add, if you guys find this stuff interesting, I always appreciate anyone who subscribes, because without you, well, nobody would watch this stuff. So, whether the virus evolved on Earth or came from somewhere else, it's pretty irrelevant because life does what life always does, and that's evolve to the given circumstances. Now, I bet you're wondering, how is this related to a biophage pathogen? Well, give me a few more seconds to talk about viruses and we'll get there. It's all coming together on this one because of basically the similarities and just the absolute strange that the biophage came to be. All life on this planet had to adapt to this infection, and in some ways that infection adapted to us. And the ways life adapted would be something like CRISPR. CRISPR in the Cas9 protein complex will read free-floating information around the cell, and if it finds that it matches a known viral coding, it will destroy it. This mechanism is observed in oceans, which allows for around 80% of the bacteria to survive the viruses, trying to use them for replication, because without it, the viruses would have probably already overwhelmed all of the bacteria in the ocean. Obviously, it isn't successful 100% of the time, but it does help. And as a side note, it is really cool because it can actually be programmed to remove genetic aberrations in our cellular DNA, which I believe at some point will allow us to correct virtually anything wrong with our bodies and lead to a second renaissance on the medical front. But moving on, how the virus has adapted to us is that it may have been the basis for life depending on what you believe. I've mentioned before, but if you take a sperm cell and an egg cell, do you find it odd that the sperm cell will essentially invade the egg cell? Where did that behavior come from? We see cells undergoing phagocytosis and engulfing cells, which is where we likely get our mitochondria, but invading cells is another animal entirely. We know 8% of our genetic coding is made up of ancient DNA viruses that implanted themselves into our coding, and it likely goes all the way back to the beginning. But with that, we draw that line of thinking to a close because we could get basically caught up talking about that for the rest of the video. Just understand this: some of the functions of our cells appear to be linked to the genetic information supplied to them by ancient viruses. And just for a fun fact, ancient virus infections actually protect us from new virus infections, strangely enough. There appears to be an inhibitory effect in the invasion process. And that's what happens when you live in a closed, well, assumingly closed, ecosystem for billions of years. But if you haven't clicked off yet, how does that relate to Callisto Protocol? Well, actually fairly easily. And for that, we need to understand what the moon Callisto is in our actual understanding of it. First thing to know is that there may actually be a massively deep liquid ocean on Callisto. The surface is obviously frozen over given its distance from the sun, which another fun fact for you, when the sun enters its red giant phase, it may actually be close enough to the sun that it will unfreeze the surface, exposing the ocean and making it quasi-habitable, which is also the same for the moon Titan. As it has been suggested, it is very similar to a primordial Earth in terms of atmospheric composition. It's just sort of stuck on slow mode due to its lack of energy that it's getting from the sun. Anyhow, with the oceans of Callisto, there may have been a similar event to Earth, or what we think are similar events in terms of Earth life there. The first thing to know is that the oceans would be pitch black, and I mean the ice is several miles thick above it, so any water at the bottom would have no light, and likely life there would be confined to the hydrothermal vents that may exist, heating up the water. The life here would have sprung up around these vents and progressed rather slowly, as it's likely there were not too many differing ecosystems in this environment. However, this is where we begin to get into the events of the actual game. See, it only took me 3 pages to get here. That's not bad. So let's get into the discussion of this, which will shed some light on everything that I've been rambling about. The story goes as such, and we won't spend too much time on it, but you need it for, any of the information I'm about to say. This has also been heavily covered over the last few weeks all over YouTube, so you're going to basically get the SparkNote version. There was a mining colony on Callisto tasked with digging into the ice, as it was unknown if the ice went all the way down to the rock of the planet or if there was an ocean down there. As the miners kept digging, they found that an illness began to arise in the colony, but nobody knew where it was actually coming from. As this disease continued to grip the colony, an emergency call would go out to try to get help for this outbreak. Well, of course, the wrong people showed up. It appears the ones who did were associated with the cult, or perhaps they stumbled across the transmission while another group was there. When they arrived, they found that many of the colonists were suffering from symptoms with a wide range of issues. It began as coughing with a fever, but progressed into decreased blood flow and damaged veins. As the disease crept further into their meat suits, this would ultimately lead to neurological issues such as weakness, muscle spasms, and ultimately loss of cognitive functions and empathy. This would suggest that the frontal lobe was under attack to some degree, but likely the entire brain was. So this in turn caused aggression to increase amongst the colonists who were infected as their humanity began slipping away from them and they started to become something else. All the while, the greatest threat began: hair loss. This is sponsored by Keep. No, it's not actually. Anyway, so eventually you had a whole bunch of balding, aggressive colonists walking around with no eyebrows before later symptoms of the infection began to descend upon them. Their body temperatures would begin increasing outside of normal ranges as their metabolisms were ramped up, showing something fundamentally was happening within their cells. This change to their baseline would continue to increase as the person began to enter a form of rapid evolution, completely dismantling any humanity they had, at least while in this form. They were still mostly bipedal, but some would completely change their physiology, becoming something completely foreign as they grew extra appendages and began to either grow with what they had or fuse into other bodies to increase overall size. Seemingly, the infected had become homogenized concerning cellular information, which spiked the interest of the aforementioned cult. The cult would continue to work with the colonists, now really direct them in one way or another, as they continued their dig cycles and finally came across a leviathan of a creature. While they were successful in putting it down with security forces, it became apparent this was a native of the planet, but but there was something strange about it. As they inspected the carcass, they found that it contained thousands of larvae that seemingly had been operating as a vector for this disease that the miners were experiencing. So while the larvae had the ability to spread this disease, they too seemed to be a byproduct of the infection, sort of like how rats spread the bubonic plague, Yersinia pestis. The larvae would be taken and transported back to Black Iron's central lab back on Europa. Meanwhile, there were some straight up medical crimes going on back on Callisto. The colony had experiments run on them in order to figure out what the illness was capable of. While most turned into highly aggressive mindless beasts, or seemingly mindless anyways, one, known as Subject Zero, was able to acclimate to the infection and retain his humanity despite the rapid evolution. Because he was able to control it, he was a direct threat, as they almost didn't know what they were creating at the time. He was then put down by security forces and had autopsies done on his body to see what, if anything, made his meat suit different from all the others that were infected. Hitting a dead end 75 years later after the outbreak, another one would be started on Europa to observe the effects, which led to a whole lot of bodies getting stacked. Meanwhile, Jacob was a cargo pilot transporting samples. Crashed on Callisto, taking out his co-pilot. He was then thrown into this mess, which if you would like to see a review of the game, I talk about all that, so I'll link it at the end of this video if you're interested. But ultimately, this disease was being used to increase the speed at which humans evolve. See, evolution in itself is the most fit are adapted to the environment, and they become the successor in that area, typically. There are issues that you could be highly successful in an environment, and then like an asteroid hit your planet, and it really doesn't matter how successful you were. But to spread amongst the stars, this would require humans to be much more capable of dealing with the trials and tribulations of not only spaceflight for extended periods of time, but also able to land on a planet or moon, quickly adapt to that environment as to survive and thrive within it. But then the question that everyone here is to learn is, what is the biophage? What is the pathogen that causes it? And what does it do exactly? Well, the biophage itself is the name of the infected human that has been altered, but the name given to the disease is referred to the biophage pathogen. So then, what can do this? Well, it's clear that the biophage is a play on bacteriophage. And a bacteriophage is a specific virus that injects its genetic material into bacterium in order to replicate itself, which will result in the destruction of the microorganism, and it's totally boned should it not be successful in utilizing its CRISPR and Cas9 protein complexes to destroy the viral coating. Likely based on the evolution that already took place on this moon and the infection that seemed to take hold, the biophage pathogen is not a naturally occurring virus on Callisto. Instead, much like how seemingly viruses on Earth came down from the sky, it appears possible that the biophage pathogen originates from somewhere else and just happened to land on Callisto while it had naturally occurring life within its oceans. And this could have been anything from being located within a comet or an asteroid or a meteorite that then struck the surface, which released the virus. Which, if you're wondering how these things grew due to the virus, it's also very unlikely the virus is what caused it. Instead, deep sea gigantism was likely the name of the game on this moon due to them having a more stable metabolism at that size, and we observed this on our own planet in the inky blackness of the ocean. Anyhow, once the virus made it off of the ice and into the waters, it likely began infecting all the organisms down there, and humanity just happened upon one, and this isn't really a fluke. Odds are there is plenty of life down there, which is now altered to the point to appear monstrous aberrations to what they originally were. Simply coming into contact with this infected species served as the vector in its own right, but the larva also served to speed up the process as the virus taking over the cells and creating these new creatures. But the next question becomes, how does the virus do what it does? Well, that's actually not a bad question. You're pretty smart, because the reality is typically these diseases do not jump species. Now, I say typically because the virus we have running around right now clearly would have jumped species as long as it's naturally occurring. We also saw this with swine flu and simian immunodeficiency virus becoming human immunodeficiency virus. Viruses can jump species, but something that is much more different about the Callisto protocol virus is the ease at which it not only moves from species to species, but it can literally jump moons and planets to infect completely independent and different forms of life. This would suggest that despite having originated on another world entirely, the fauna of Callisto do appear to be DNA based like we are, or at least somewhat similar concerning cellular functions to us that the virus is able to exploit, but more likely than that, the cell is not absolutely relied on. The virus is literally hijacking control. Once coming into contact with the biophage pathogen, it will quickly enter the epithelial tissue of the lungs and trachea. This causes the telltale telltale coughing symptoms as tissues in the area become inflamed and the immune system is mobilized in order to combat this invader. However, it will have no chance of actually clearing this infection, so all is for naught. Typically, a virus will use markers on the surface to identify itself as something that it isn't, as then it's able to link to the surface, which allows for the virus to disseminate its genetic material into the cell to begin the process. With this, we know some viruses on this planet actually do contain an enzyme called reverse transcriptase. This will allow for it to convert its genes from RNA into DNA, and once this is done, it will then deploy an enzyme known as integrase. This enzyme's responsibility is to take the viral DNA and just slam it into your normal DNA. Once this is done, congratulations, it's a boy. You have a virus with you until that gene is destroyed during replication errors over time, although likely it will never be destroyed. And this means that at any point, if this is read, the cell will then release more of this virus, and this allows for the virus to go dormant in your body but still exist within you. And this is why it may seem like overkill, but if your T cells figure out you have a viral infection, they will tell the cell to explode on the chance that it has gone into the DNA itself and replicated there. The biophage pathogen uses a similar measure, but for it again to jump entire forms of life, it likely bypasses the marker on the surface and just attacks the cells. If it was able to essentially spear the cell and break through the cell membrane, it can then inject its genetic coding and enzymes, taking the cell by force. No cellular compliance is required. Now, the cell isn't just going to take this lying down, so it'll yell for help all while this is happening, and this is known as an interferon. Now, clearly the biophage pathogen would not know what genes were responsible in your genetic coding for the production of this material, so it may also inject something to calm the cell's metabolism. Slowing down the chemical reactions leads to less yelling for help and less outside influence by the immune system. But again, your body isn't just designed to take this lying down. As the biophage pathogen continues to infect the lungs, it will eventually enter the bloodstream, which is where we really see the struggle for control. Likely in some, you would have a little bit of the biophage pathogen being destroyed, but it is such a foreign virus that our bodies may have difficulty getting a handle on it, especially out of the gate. During this critical point, the person's innate immune system would be activated to scoop up any viruses that they can find, but also increase inflammation to try to get everything under control. When this fails, as the virus continues to move via the bloodstream, eventually this would cause your body to hit the panic button as it was being overwhelmed. It would turn instead to its nuclear option, which you might guess ain't great. This cytokine storm results in the damage of blood vessels and overall weakness in the body. As the cytokines are released, this basically tells the immune system to attack with everything it has. It's trying to do its job to alert the immune system, but there is massive collateral damage leading to burst blood vessels. With leaky blood vessels all over the body, blood flow efficiency decreases and neurological cells become damaged by the lack of incoming oxygen. This in turn can lead to brain damage, which is noted in the decreased mental capacity and cognitive functions, which if your cognitive functions in your frontal lobe decrease, you're definitely going to feel it, and other people are definitely going to notice it. Eventually, the person falls into a full animalistic tendency as all their humanity is removed from them. But then this brings into question what was up with Subject Zero. Interestingly, I have to make this connection, just because I noticed it while I was writing this. Whereas a strong immune system would help you resist the effects of the markers in dead space, I believe a certain level of being immunocompromised is what is exhibited in Callisto Protocol. If you follow the pathway from human to monster, and bearing in mind this virus forces evolution onto you to survive, you can see why people become what they are. When their immune systems respond in a standard way to this infection, on a cell-by-cell basis, the genetic coding of the cell is altered and then attacked by T cells, as they are likely presenting different cellular markers, delineating them as not supposed to be here. This is seen with the hair loss. This is not just happening for funsies. Those cells are being attacked and expiring by the immune system. The war being waged in the bloodstream for control is due to what's in the blood being attacked by the immune system. Basically, the rug is pulled out from underneath your immune system before it even knows what's happening, which this causes it to attack everything, and with everything it's got while it's in control. This leads to the damage in the body, as then the virus is forced to alter the cells in a way that allows them to live with what they have. In this case, with the decreased mental capacity due to the traumatic brain injuries brought on by the sepsis inspired by the immune system and difficulty controlling the body due to oxygen not being delivered correctly, the body undergoes physiological changes, and with an increased metabolic speed, this allows for the changes in the body to take place in a few hours rather than millions of years through natural selection. This would also imply that the mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cell, which also has its own genetic coding if you didn't know that, is affected, which isn't surprising given that the virus really doesn't care as long as there's coding to be influenced. So the virus ramps up the speed by implanting more genes into the mitochondria, which allows for the cells to have the energy reserves to begin rapidly dividing and changing into something else that's less than human in my opinion. Also, just note this, the rapid cellular division that we have seen would absolutely cook anything due to the heat generated. Just wanted to point that out. But this also helps to explain Subject Zero and why it was so difficult to replicate. Subject Zero had something critically wrong with their immune system, or at least it's hypothesized by me to be so. At some area, for some reason, there was a break in the line of communication, likely between the innate and adaptive immune system. Because of this, if there were, say, a chance that they ran across an Earth-based disease, they likely would have perished as they were immunocompromised. However, running across something completely alien like this virus, not only did their body not know how to properly even identify this virus, but it didn't even know how to respond to it. Normally, your body will at least take a crack at it. Because of this, while typically a person's body would be going sicko mode trying to destroy the virus, damaging the body in horrendous ways, all the while actually solidifying the monster that they would become, Subject Zero immune system had a light, if any, response, stopping the cytokine storm from even happening in the first place, allowing the body to adequately move oxygen through it, and after the changes to the body were already made, they weren't even really needed in some mega capacity as there was no threat from the body in the environment that they were in. They were still adapted to the environment that they were in, but their body wasn't destroying them from the inside, so the virus didn't have to adapt to that. This was interpreted by the cult as something that made him special when really the information was there all along. You see, nature is already us and we are it. Releasing a pathogen in an environment to freeball isn't really that great because unless the response is just an all-out lockdown for months at a time, the disease is going to spread through people very naturally. Instead of trying to figure out what made Subject Zero survive, they instead focused on the wrong thing by assuming it to be environmental. Although there is a case to be made that at least to some degree, they did try to figure out if there was something special about the individual because they were experimenting on the prisoners. It's clear that behind the screens on the prison walls, people were being experimented on to see what made it work. However, disabling just a piece of the immune system is a little more difficult than you might imagine, as your body still does want to survive. And nuking someone's immune system capabilities entirely would mean that any exposure event would quickly have them falter and then expire. Like literally even breathing in mold when you're immunocompromised can allow that infection to flourish. And we're breathing in mold spores, thousands of them all the time. But this would mean that Subject Zero had a very unique set of circumstances not seen in the human population in any great numbers, or at least with the hundreds of people who were on the colony on Europa, but maybe it was like thousands, because then when you add in the prisoners, it's the same thing. But that's not even really that strange. If you took someone from Earth and brought them up to another moon or planet, and they have kids, within just a few generations, likely they couldn't even return to Earth without a biosafety level 4 suit, because naturally occurring illnesses on this planet would overwhelm them. But this in turn could weaken the immune system to anyone born on a planet, or could actually cause pre-existing issues to arise in them that had not yet been seen. I mean, we like to think our immune systems are these robust, stout things, but even issues like not being subjected to parasites enough can cause an overreaction in your immune system. That's why allergies in first world countries are on the rise, or so it seems. So then by trying to recapture that process without an actual understanding of what caused it in the first place, that makes the warden, likened to a member of the media, trying to lecture us about current events with a degree in journalism, while the rest of the bio majors are laughing at them as they stumble through a sentence about what's happening. Straight cringe, bro. But ultimately, this is an alien virus that should probably not be messed around with, because our biological being and the way our bodies simply operate would mean this virus is not compatible in any capacity except in the rarest of rare interactions. After infection, and as a response to the body's defenses, this will result in a monster possibly not even due to the virus, but due to our functioning. If anything, what they should be searching for is how the virus adapts the genetic coding of a person. This would imply there is something coded into the virus that increases the metabolisms and possibly the recombination of genes, which allows for it to cycle through many times in order to allow for changes in the body and new possibilities. We see this recombination of DNA during things like meiosis, not to be confused with mitosis, as mitosis is when your somatic cells divide, but meiosis is when your sex cells divide in order to change up the DNA just slightly, which may or may not make you more adapted to your environment. However, once formed, this process typically stops. The virus clearly reactivates this process in a completely new way within the body to force evolution if you are damaged, or allow for the body that is undamaged to adapt to a new environment in days rather than generations. Basically, it makes your DNA more dynamic. The concept of something like this would be highly useful, and if studied in a proper environment, could be taken from the virus. But by releasing the chaotic virus in a chaotic environment, this allowed for monsters to come to be, which we will talk about in the next episode over Callisto Protocol. But I want to thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, then leaving a like would be great. And subscribing is a great way to stay up to date on when I post. I'll drop my Twitter, Discord, Patreon, and channel links in the description. I actually do have a creepypasta read over on Roanoke Tales. I think it's being edited right now, so that's coming back. And speaking of patrons, I'd like to thank mine real quick. First, huge thank you to our astronaut, Wesley A. Weaver Jr., holding it down. Thanks, man. I'd also like to thank our astrophysicist, Des Dancer, and Phoenix, as well as our scientists, Countryside Limbo, Lacune, and Vibing Shockwave. And to the rest of my patrons, I thank you guys as well. Your help goes a long way towards keeping everything running and is greatly appreciated. All right, so that does it for me. I hope everyone enjoyed, and I will see y'all in the next one.